The house next door had been empty for 6 months, a silent, gray-shingled box that mirrored the quiet vacancy of my own life. I worked from home, a graphic designer tethered to a glowing screen, my social interactions curated into neat, billable hours and polite email sign-offs. My world was a 2,000-square-foot echo chamber, and I was both the sound and the silence. Then, the moving trucks came, groaning up the quiet suburban street like beasts of burden, and my carefully constructed solitude was breached. His name was Julian. I learned that from the nosy chatter of Mr. Henderson from across the street, a man whose lawn was as immaculate as his repository of neighborhood gossip. Julian was, according to Henderson, a carpenter or a furniture maker or something equally, vaguely masculine and hands-on. He'd bought the house for a song, a city transplant looking for quiet. I found the irony delicious. He'd moved to a quiet street and landed next to a man who had practically perfected the art of monastic silence. For the first few weeks, I only saw him in flashes. A broad back hauling a box, the silhouette of a man wrestling a ridiculously oversized armchair through a doorway, the glint of sweat on a tanned neck as he mowed the lawn for the first time, shirtless, a fact my brain registered with an alarming, clinical detachment that was anything but. He was a series of disconnected, physical truths. Strong hands, a solid, grounded way of walking, as if he was personally offended by the planet's attempt to spin beneath his feet. A jaw that could have been carved from granite. I observed him from the window of my home office, the one that overlooked his driveway and the cavernous mouth of his two-car garage. It became a ritual, a break from kerning fonts and adjusting color palettes. I'd watch him set up his workshop, the organized chaos of saws and sanders and wood clamps slowly filling the space. The air, on days when the wind was just right, would carry the scent of freshly cut pine and something sharp, like varnish, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of my own home. He was a creature of tangible things, of dust and effort, while I lived in a world of pixels and light. Our first real interaction was mundane, almost painfully so. My package, a new set of expensive illustrating pens, was mistakenly delivered to his doorstep. I saw the delivery driver drop it, saw Julian emerge a few minutes later, squinting at the label. I watched him turn, his eyes scanning the front of my house. For a moment, I considered just letting him keep them, ordering a new set, doing anything to avoid the impending social contract of a conversation. But they were expensive, and I was, if nothing else, frugal. I opened my front door just as he was starting down his walkway, the small cardboard box in his hand. He stopped. He had this way of looking at you, a direct, unblinking gaze that felt like an appraisal. His eyes were a startlingly light brown, the color of whiskey in a sunbeam. "This you?" he asked. His voice was lower than I'd expected, with a gravelly texture, like stones rolling over each other. It was the voice of someone who didn't speak unless he had something to say. I nodded, my own voice feeling ridiculously thin in comparison. "Leo." "Yeah, that's me. Sorry about that." He closed the distance between us, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe just a shade over my own 6 feet, but he was built with a density that made him seem to take up more space. The shoulders of his plain gray t-shirt were stretched taut. He held the box out, but he didn't let go immediately when I took it. His fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against mine. A flicker of something, a static charge, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back a little too quickly. "No problem." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a small, knowing little smirk. "Julian, right?" The new neighbor, my eloquence was, as ever, breathtaking. He leaned against my porch railing, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement was casual, but it was also an act of settling in, of claiming the space. He wasn't leaving just yet. My heart did a nervous little stutter step. "Heard you work from home," he said. It wasn't a question. Gossip travels fast. It's a small street. His gaze drifted up to my office window, the one I was so often stationed at, and then back to my face. The smirk deepened. "Nice view." Heat flooded my neck. He knew. Of course he knew. The idea should have been mortifying, a violation of my private, one-sided voyeurism. But the way he said it, with that low, rumbling voice and the glint in his whiskey-colored eyes, it didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like an invitation. like a shared secret. It's efficient, I managed, clutching the box of pens like a shield. He chuckled, a short, breathy sound. Right. Efficient, he pushed off the railing, the relaxed posture gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. Well, Leo, I'll see you around. He turned and walked back toward his house, his stride just as grounded as ever. I stood there on my porch for a long time, the warmth of his fingers still humming on my skin, the echo of his voice in my ears. The silence he left behind was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the distinct, unsettling, and utterly captivating presence of Julian. My quiet, gray world had just had a door kicked open, and a whole lot of color was starting to spill in. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, one dictated by the open door of Julian's garage. It became my second monitor. My gaze would drift from the sterile blue light of my screen to the warm, yellow glow of his workshop. I learned the sounds of his work, the high-pitched whine of the table saw biting into wood, the rhythmic hiss of a sander, the satisfying thud of a mallet striking a chisel. These were the sounds of creation, of something real being brought into existence through force and precision. I, on the other hand, spent my days with the click-clack of a keyboard and the whisper-quiet scroll of a mouse. My creations were ephemeral, existing only as long as there was power to illuminate them. I once spent an entire afternoon designing a logo for an artisanal dog biscuit company, a process that involved staring at 50 different shades of beige. That same afternoon, I watched Julian plane a long, beautiful slab of dark walnut, the curls of wood falling to the concrete floor like discarded ringlets. The contrast was not lost on me. He was always aware of my watching. I was sure of it. Sometimes, in the middle of a task, he would pause, wipe his brow with the back of his forearm, and his head would turn just slightly, his gaze flicking up toward my window. He never waved. He never gave a big, obvious sign. It was always more subtle than that. A slight tilt of his head, a momentary pause in his work. It was a silent acknowledgement, a current of awareness that flowed between our two houses, across the neatly manicured strip of grass that separated us. My internal monologue became a running commentary on the Julian show. Look at the way the sawdust clings to the hair on his arms. He's been wearing that same faded black Sabbath shirt for 3 days. I wonder what he's building. Is that a chair? A table? I bet his hands are rough. I bet they smell like wood and turpentine. It was an endless, looping reel of observations and speculations, a form of self-torture that was equal parts frustrating and thrilling. I was an anthropologist studying a tribe of one, and my subject was magnificent. Our interactions remained brief, fragmentary. He'd be out checking his mail at the same time I was taking out the recycling. "Morning, Leo," he'd grumble, his voice still thick with sleep. And I'd offer a tight, closed-mouth smile and a nod, my own voice invariably lodged somewhere in my throat. One Saturday, I was attempting to wrestle a flat-pack bookshelf into my house. It was a long, unwieldy box, and I was losing the battle decisively on my front lawn. The cardboard corner dug into my hip, the whole thing threatening to tip and crush my prize-winning azaleas. "Need a hand with that." His voice, coming from directly behind me, made me jump. I hadn't heard him approach. I turned, and he was standing there, wiping his hands on a rag. He had a smudge of dark stain on his cheek, just below his eye. My first, absurd thought was that it looked like war paint. "I've got it," I said, lying through my teeth as the box slipped another inch. He let out that low chuckle again. Without asking for permission, he moved to the other end of the box, his hands easily finding purchase. "On 3, he said, not as a suggestion, but as a command. 1, 2, 3 inch. We lifted. It was effortless with him on the other side. His proximity was overwhelming. I could smell him now, not just the workshop sense of wood and chemicals, but something more personal. A faint, clean scent of soap and the warm, musky smell of a man who had been working hard. It was intoxicating. We maneuvered the box through the doorway and into my living room. I let my end drop with a thud, breathing heavily. He lowered his with a controlled grace. "Thanks," I said, my voice a little breathless. I don't think I would have gotten that inside without taking out the doorframe. Any time his eyes roamed my living room. It was neat, minimalist, and aggressively impersonal. Gray walls, a gray sofa, a single, abstract painting that was also mostly gray. It was the physical manifestation of my personality. You really like gray, huh? I felt a defensive blush creep up my neck. It's calming. It's hospital waiting room chic. He said it with a straight face, but the corner of his mouth twitched. He tapped the box with the toe of his boot. You going to be able to put this thing together by yourself? I have instructions. And an Allen key. I think I can manage. Famous last words. He looked from the box to me, his gaze lingering. I could help. I'm pretty good with instructions. The offer hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. Him. In my house. For an extended period of time. My brain short-circuited. All the potential conversational pitfalls, the awkward silences, the sheer, terrifying intimacy of it, flashed before my eyes. I'm good, I said, the words tasting like cowardice. But thanks for the offer. And for the help getting it in. A flicker of something, disappointment, amusement, crossed his face before it was gone, replaced by that familiar, unreadable mask. Sure thing, Leo. He gave a short, two-fingered wave and was gone, the front door clicking shut behind him. I stared at the flat-pack box. For the next 4 hours, I wrestled with particle board and 1,000 tiny screws, the ghost of his offer mocking me. At one point, I put a shelf in upside down and had to take the whole thing apart. I cursed the Allen key. I cursed the Swedish furniture conglomerate that designed it. But mostly, I cursed myself. He had offered, and I had said no. I had been offered a splash of color, and I had chosen to remain in the gray. The finished bookshelf stood slightly crooked against the wall, a monument to my own stubborn solitude. The power went out on a Tuesday night in late October. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the wind rattling my windows with an angry insistence. I was trying to finish a project, a sleek, soulless website for a financial consulting firm, when my screen went black. The hum of the refrigerator died. The digital clock on the microwave vanished. The world plunged into an abrupt, profound silence. My first instinct was panic. My work wasn't saved. My deadline was tomorrow. My whole life, it seemed, was dependent on a steady flow of electricity. My second thought, following quickly on the heels of the first, was of Julian. I went to the window. His house was dark, too. The entire street was a black hole, punctuated only by the frantic, sweeping beams of an occasional car headlight. I fumbled in a kitchen drawer for my emergency candles, the ones I'd bought years ago and never used. The scent of vanilla and regret filled the air as I lit them. The flickering light threw long, dancing shadows across my sterile gray walls, making the room feel strange and unfamiliar. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, oppressive thing, amplifying the sound of my own anxious breathing. I was contemplating the bleak prospect of eating a can of cold tuna for dinner when there was a knock at my front door. It was a solid, confident knock. Julian's knock. My heart gave a nervous leap. I smoothed down my shirt, a ridiculous gesture in the near-total darkness, and opened the door. He stood on my porch, a dark shape against the deeper darkness of the night. He was holding 2 beers in one hand and a powerful-looking flashlight in the other. The beam cut a sharp cone of light, illuminating the concerned look on his face. "You okay over here?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that was immensely reassuring in the unsettling quiet. "Just me and my impending sense of doom," I said, trying for levity. "My whole life is on a hard drive that I can't turn on." He offered a sympathetic grimace. "Yeah, that sucks." He held up the beers. "Figured misery loves company. My place is a mess of half-finished projects. Yours at least looks like you can't trip over a bandsaw." It was the easiest thing in the world to say yes. The alternative was sitting alone in the dark, contemplating my poor life choices. "Come on in." He stepped inside, bringing the clean, cold smell of the stormy night with him. He swept the flashlight beam around my living room, the shadows leaping and dancing. "Nice candle setup. Very romantic. It's either this or sit in total darkness." The vanilla scent was an unfortunate bonus. He handed me a beer. It was cold against my palm. He found his way to the sofa as if he'd been there 100 times, sinking into the cushions with a weary sigh. I sat down at the other end, leaving a careful, deliberate gap of at least 3 feet between us. The candle on the coffee table cast a warm, flickering glow on his face, carving sharp angles from his cheekbones and jaw. The smudge of stain from the other day was gone, but I could still see it in my mind's eye. "They said on the radio it might be a while," he said, taking a long pull from his bottle. Transformer blew a few blocks over. Of course it did. I took a sip of my own beer. It was a craft IPA, something bitter and hoppy. It tasted like something he would drink. So much for my deadline. The world will survive one more day without another financial consulting website. He leaned his head back against the sofa, looking up at the ceiling. In the flickering light, I saw the hard lines of his face soften. The usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet pensiveness. "What about you?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. What masterpiece was interrupted? He was quiet for a moment. "A cradle," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "For my sister. She's due in a couple of months." The image was so unexpected, so tender, that it caught me off guard. Julian, the stoic, slightly intimidating craftsman, building a cradle. It was a detail that didn't fit with the carefully constructed persona I had built for him in my head. "That's really nice," I said, the words feeling inadequate. He shrugged, but it was a gesture heavy with meaning. "It's what I do. I make things. Things people use. Things that last." He turned his head, his whiskey-colored eyes finding mine in the gloom. "Better than making things people just look at on a screen, right?" There was no malice in it, no judgment. It was a genuine question, and it hit a little too close to home. "Sometimes," I admitted, my gaze dropping to the beer bottle in my hands. "Sometimes I feel like I spend all day shouting into the digital void." "I used to do that," he said quietly. "Not literally. I was in marketing. In the city. Long hours, big paycheck, soulless work. Sold my soul convincing people to buy things they didn't need." He took another drink. "Woke up one day and realized I hadn't made a single real thing with my own two hands in over a decade. So I quit. Cashed out. Bought that place." He gestured with his bottle in the direction of his house. "Figured I'd try making things that mattered for a while." The confession hung in the air between us, as intimate as a whisper. He was sharing a piece of himself, a part of his story that wasn't visible from my office window. The playful instigator, the confident observer, was peeling back a layer, showing me the man underneath. And that man was someone who had been just as lost as I was. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the sighing of the wind outside and the occasional clink of our beer bottles on the coffee table. The 3-foot gap between us on the sofa suddenly felt like a vast, empty chasm. The vanilla from the candle seemed less cloying now, more like a sweet, warm backdrop to the unfolding scene. For the first time, I wasn't overthinking. I wasn't analyzing his every move or trying to decipher his hidden meanings. I was just there, with him, in the dark. And it felt surprisingly, terrifyingly right. The conversation flowed more easily after that. We didn't solve any of the world's problems. We talked about bad movies, the best place to get pizza in town, the time he almost cut his thumb off with a chisel. It was easy, normal conversation, the kind I usually avoided at all costs. But with him, in the cocooning darkness, it felt different. It felt necessary. He had a surprisingly sharp, dry wit. He told a story about his first attempt at woodworking, a birdhouse that ended up looking more like a deconstructed cubist nightmare. And I found myself laughing. A real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. The sound surprised me. It echoed in the quiet room, and I saw him smile in the candlelight. A real smile this time, not the knowing smirk. It reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. At some point, he stood up and stretched, his large frame seeming to fill the entire room. "Need another one?" he asked, gesturing toward the kitchen with his empty bottle. "I think I still have some in the back of the fridge. From a barbecue I was guilted into attending last summer. A man of the people, I see." He disappeared into the blackness of my kitchen, and I listened to the sounds of him rummaging around. The clink of bottles, the soft thud of the refrigerator door. It was an oddly domestic sound, a sound that belonged in this house. He returned a moment later with 2 more beers, his shadow preceding him, long and distorted on the wall. When he sat back down, he chose a spot closer to me. The 3-foot gap was now maybe 1 foot. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My senses, already heightened by the darkness and the beer, went into overdrive. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of hops on his breath, the clean soap smell, the warmth of his skin. My own breathing hitched. "So, Leo the graphic designer," he said, his voice a low murmur. "What's your story? You grow up around here." It was a simple question, but it felt loaded. People didn't ask about my story. I was the guy who kept to himself, the quiet neighbor, the faceless freelancer. I was a background character in other people's lives. Not far from here, I said, my voice tight. Small town. Came here for college, never left. And you like it? The quiet life? He was watching me intently, his head tilted. The candlelight cast a deep shadow in the hollow of his throat. I found my eyes drawn to the rhythmic pulse I could see there. Is this what you want? The question was unspoken, but I heard it all the same. It was in his eyes, in the deliberate way he had closed the distance between us. It's predictable, I finally answered, the word tasting like an excuse. I like knowing what to expect. Do you? He took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving my face. Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who's waiting for something to happen. His perception was a physical blow. He saw it. He saw right through the gray walls and the minimalist furniture and the carefully curated silence. He saw the yearning. He saw the loneliness that I tried so hard to disguise as independence. I had no response. The truth of his statement had stolen the air from my lungs. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I could feel his gaze on me, patient, waiting. This is it. The moment where I could retreat back into my shell, make a joke, change the subject, and let the opportunity drift away like smoke. Or I could stay. I could hold his gaze and let him see that he was right. I met his eyes. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, suspended in the flickering golden light. The storm outside, my looming deadline, the entire universe, it all faded away. There was only the foot of space between us, crackling with a tension that was more powerful than the blown transformer down the street. It was the silence before a lightning strike. He slowly, deliberately, placed his beer on the coffee table. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Then, he turned his body fully toward me. His knee brushed against mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight through me. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Leo, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The sound of my name on his lips was an intimacy all its own. I just stared at him, my mind a complete and utter blank. All the words, all the anxieties, all the overthinking, it had all been burned away, leaving only this raw, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling. He was waiting for a sign, a nod, a breath, anything that told him it was okay to cross that final, terrifying inch. I didn't know how to give it. I had spent a lifetime building walls, and I had forgotten how to open a door. So he did it for me. He reached out, his movements unhurried, and his fingers brushed against my jaw. His touch was hesitant at first, questioning. His thumb was calloused, rough against my skin, but the gesture was incredibly gentle. He was giving me every opportunity to pull back, to say no. I leaned into his touch. Just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. It was the sign he was waiting for. A soft sound, something between a sigh and a groan, escaped his lips. His eyes, dark and endless in the candlelight, searched mine for a fraction of a second longer, and then he closed the distance. The power outage lasted for another 4 hours, but I barely noticed. The world outside my living room ceased to exist. Our conversation had been a bridge, and now we had crossed it, leaving the familiar shoreline of polite neighborly conduct far behind. We were in uncharted territory now. After that first, earth-shattering moment of contact, the tension didn't so much break as transform. It shifted from a crackling, anxious energy into a heavy, languid current that pulled us both under. He didn't kiss me then. He just held his hand against my face, his thumb stroking slowly, rhythmically, along the line of my jaw. It was a gesture of profound patience, a silent communication that was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We have time." I am not a man accustomed to being touched. My life was a series of near misses, hands that didn't linger, shoulders that didn't brush, a world viewed from a safe distance. To have Julian's hand on me, so deliberately, so gently, was overwhelming. Every nerve ending in my body felt like it was firing at once. My entire consciousness seemed to narrow, focusing on that single point of contact. The rough texture of his skin, the warmth seeping into me, the sheer, solid reality of him. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. I hadn't even realized it. A fine tremor was running through me, a physical manifestation of the war being waged inside me between a lifetime of fear and a moment of breathtaking hope. Sorry, I whispered, the words sounding inadequate and foolish. Don't be. His fingers threaded into the hair at the nape of my neck, the gesture both possessive and incredibly tender. His palm was warm against my skin. It's okay. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing in the charged silence. The vanilla candle flickered, its sweet scent now inextricably linked in my mind with the smell of rain and the warm, masculine scent of Julian. I watched the play of light on his face, the way it highlighted the curve of his lip, the strong column of his throat. My obsessive observation had found a new, terrifyingly close focus. Eventually, he spoke again, his voice still a low murmur that seemed to bypass my ears and sink directly into my bones. You watch me from your window. It wasn't a question. It was the same statement from our first real conversation, but this time it wasn't a tease. It was a confession he was drawing from me. I swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. Yes. Why? The simple question was a scalpel, cutting straight to the heart of everything. Why? Because you're alive in a way I've forgotten how to be. Because you build things with your hands while I move pixels with a mouse. Because you are a splash of vibrant, dangerous color in my meticulously organized gray world. Because I am lonelier than I have ever been willing to admit, and you are the first thing that has made me want to be less alone. I couldn't say any of that. The words were too big, too honest. They would have shattered the fragile, beautiful thing that was building between us. I don't know. I lied, my voice barely audible. He knew it was a lie. I could see it in his eyes. But he didn't push. He just continued his slow, hypnotic stroking of my neck. Tell me to stop, Leo, he whispered, his gaze dropping to my mouth. If this isn't what you want, tell me to stop right now. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My mind was screaming at me, a chorus of all my deepest insecurities. This is a mistake. He's just playing with you. You're going to get hurt. You're not built for this. But for the first time in my life, I didn't listen to that voice. I listened to the deeper, quieter thing that had been buried for so long. The part of me that had been watching him from the window, yearning. I shook my head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Don't stop. That was all it took. The last of his restraint seemed to dissolve. His eyes darkened, and he leaned in, his other hand coming up to cup my face, holding me as if I were something precious. His lips met mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, inquisitive. It was a question, and my response was the answer. I felt a shudder run through his body, or maybe it was mine. I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. The taste of beer and something that was uniquely him, warm and masculine and real, flooded my senses. My hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart under my palm, a rhythm that was far more confident than my own. The kiss deepened, the initial gentleness giving way to a desperate, hungry need that had clearly been simmering under the surface for weeks. It was in the way his fingers tightened in my hair, the way his mouth slanted over mine, the low groan that rumbled in his chest. And I met him there. All the pent-up observation, the silent yearning, the lonely nights, it all poured into that kiss. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, and it was the most terrifying, most exhilarating feeling of my life. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his warm breath on my lips. The silence that returned was different now. It was filled with the echo of what had just happened, a sated, humming quiet. Leo, he breathed, the name a prayer. I couldn't speak. I just kept my hands on his chest, anchoring myself to him, proving to myself that he was real, that this was real. The power could stay out forever for all I cared. In the flickering candlelight of my gray living room, I had finally found a light of my own. He was it. The night didn't end there. It unfolded slowly, a series of firsts. The first time his hand slid from my chest down to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all. The first time I was brave enough to let my own fingers trace the strong line of his jaw, feeling the slight rasp of his evening stubble. Each new touch was a revelation, a verse in a poem I hadn't known I was desperate to read. We didn't talk much. Words felt clumsy and inadequate, blunt instruments in a moment that required the delicate precision of touch and breath and shared glances in the wavering candlelight. He led me from the couch, his hand warm and firm in mine, our intertwined fingers a promise. He guided me through the darkness of my own house, a place I knew by heart, but which felt entirely new when seen through his eyes, experienced through his touch. My bedroom was as Spartan as the rest of the house. A bed, a dresser, a single lamp. No photos, no clutter. A blank slate. When he saw it, illuminated by the beam of the flashlight he'd picked up from the coffee table, he didn't mock its austerity. He just turned to me, his expression softening, and reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from my forehead. "It's quiet in here," he said. "I like quiet," I replied, the old refrain sounding weak even to my own ears. "There's quiet," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "And then there's lonely." He switched off the flashlight, plunging us back into the soft, forgiving darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "You don't have to be lonely anymore." That was the moment I broke. Not with a sob or a torrent of words, but with a quiet, internal fracturing of the dam I had built around my heart. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my temple. He felt it, his thumb catching the moisture with an impossible gentleness. He didn't comment on it. He just leaned in and kissed the spot where the tear had been, a gesture of such profound acceptance that it undid me completely. The hours that followed are a blur of sensory details. The scent of his skin, warm and clean. The surprising softness of his lips against the shell of my ear, whispering my name. The weight of his body next to mine in the bed, a solid, grounding presence that chased away the ghosts of 1,000 empty nights. The sound of our breathing, mingling in the quiet room, creating a new kind of silence, one that was shared and peaceful. This is what it feels like. The thought is a constant, looping refrain in my mind. This is what it feels like to be wanted, to be touched, to be seen. My body, which for so long had felt like a simple vessel for my overactive brain, becomes a source of overwhelming sensation and pleasure. Every brush of his hand, every press of his lips, awakens a part of me I had long considered dormant, if not dead. I am not just a mind that observes. I am a body that feels. He is both impossibly gentle and fiercely passionate. He learns the landscape of my body with the same focused intensity I've seen him apply to a piece of wood, his hands mapping my ribs, my hips, the curve of my spine. He discovers the places that make me gasp, the touch that makes me tremble, and he returns to them again and again, his gaze never leaving my face, as if my reaction is the only thing in the world that matters. In the deepest, quietest part of the night, with the storm outside having finally exhausted itself, I lay with my head on his chest, my ear pressed against his sternum. I can hear the slow, steady thrum of his heart, a powerful, life-affirming rhythm. His hand is threaded through my hair, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my scalp. The gesture is so casual, so domestic, it makes my own heart ache with a feeling so potent it threatens to overwhelm me. "You're quiet," he murmurs into the darkness, his voice vibrating through his chest and into my ear. "I'm thinking," I reply. "What about?" I hesitate. I could give him a simple answer. Or I could give him the truth. For the first time, the truth doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like a necessity. "I'm thinking," I begin, my voice soft, "that for the past month, I've been watching you build things. A chair, a table, that cradle. And I was jealous." I feel his chest rise and fall with a slow breath. "Jealous of the furniture?" he asks, a hint of his usual wry humor in his tone. "Jealous of the certainty," I clarify. "You take something raw and you make it into something real, something with a purpose. I was jealous that you knew how to do that." I lift my head to look at him, though I can only make out the dark shape of his face in the gloom. And I'm thinking that maybe this is what that feels like. Taking something raw and making it real. He is silent for a long time. The silence stretches, and for a terrifying second, the old anxieties begin to creep back in. I've said too much. I've been too honest. I've scared him off with my clumsy, overwrought metaphors. Then, his hand tightens in my hair, and he gently pulls my head back down to his chest. He presses a firm kiss to the top of my head. "Get some sleep, Leo," he whispers. His voice is thick with an emotion I can't name. I close my eyes, the steady beat of his heart a lullaby. For the first time in years, I fall asleep not because I'm exhausted, but because I feel safe. I am not alone in the quiet. I am not alone in the dark. I am home. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face, and the even more unfamiliar sensation of being alone in my bed. The space next to me was empty. The sheet was cool to the touch. Panic, cold and immediate, seized me. It was a visceral, sickening lurch in my gut. He was gone. Of course he was gone. It was a dream, a fantasy born of a power outage and too much beer. A moment of weakness, of curiosity. A story he would tell his friends, laughing. You'll never believe the weird, quiet guy next door. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was just as it had always been, gray, sterile, empty. The only evidence he had ever been there was the slight indentation on the pillow next to mine and the faint, lingering scent of his skin, a scent I was already trying desperately to commit to memory before it faded completely. This is what you get, the cruel voice in my head hissed. This is what you get for wanting something. For opening the door. For letting someone in. The gray was safe. The silence was safe. This agonizing hope followed by crushing disappointment. This was the price of color. I swung my legs out of bed, my movements jerky and robotic. I had to know for sure. I had to see the closed door, the empty house, the return to normalcy. I pulled on a t-shirt and walked out of the bedroom, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. I was steeling myself for the sight of the empty living room, the 2 beer bottles on the coffee table, the only remnants of the night. But the living room wasn't empty. The first thing I registered was the smell. Coffee. Rich and dark and wonderful. And then I saw him. Julian was in my kitchen. He was standing in front of my counter, his back to me, wearing the same jeans from last night, but nothing else. His back was a masterpiece of muscle and bone, the lines of his spine and shoulders moving with a fluid grace as he stirred something in a mug. The morning light from the kitchen window poured over him, illuminating the fine, dark hair on his forearms, the strong column of his neck. He looked as if he belonged there, as if he had been standing in my kitchen, making coffee, every morning for years. The panic in my chest didn't just subside, it evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. I leaned against the doorframe, my hand over my heart, as if to physically keep it from bursting out of my chest. He must have heard me, because he turned. He had a small, soft smile on his face. Not the cocky smirk, not the teasing grin. This was something new, something quiet and genuine. His eyes, the color of warm whiskey, held mine. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. I couldn't find my own voice. I just stared at him, taking in the sight of him in my kitchen, the coffee, the sunlight, the sheer, unbelievable domesticity of it all. He held up a mug. It was one of my mugs, a plain gray one, of course. "I figured you might need this," he said. I let myself in. The door was unlocked, then he added, a hint of the old teasing glinting in his eyes. "You should probably lock your doors, Leo. This is a quiet street, but it's not that quiet." I finally managed to push myself off the doorframe and walk toward him. I felt exposed, vulnerable, in my wrinkled t-shirt and boxers, my hair a mess. But he didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. His gaze was warm, accepting. I took the mug from him. Our fingers brushed. The same jolt of electricity from the very first time we'd touched, but this time it wasn't startling. It was familiar. It was grounding. "I thought you left," I admitted, the words coming out in a quiet rush. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. He searched my face, and I knew he could see the lingering panic in my eyes. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I wouldn't do that." He reached out, his hand settling on my waist, his thumb stroking my hip bone through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. "I was going to. My first instinct was to sneak out before you woke up. Make it less complicated." "Why didn't you?" I whispered. "Because that would have been the easy thing to do," he said, his eyes holding mine. "And I'm tired of doing the easy thing." His thumb continued its slow, steady rhythm. "And because I woke up, and you were there, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to be anywhere else." The honesty of his confession was a balm on the raw, anxious parts of my soul. He had felt it, too. The fear. the urge to retreat to the safety of solitude. But he had stayed. For me. I took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and black, just how I liked it. How did he know that? Had I told him? I couldn't remember. Or maybe he just knew. Maybe he was just that perceptive. We stood there in the quiet of my kitchen, the morning sun warming our skin. His hand was a warm, heavy weight on my hip. I was holding a mug of coffee he had made for me. It was the most intimate, most romantic moment of my entire life. More intimate than the darkness and the whispers and the fumbling explorations of the night before. This was real. This was daylight. So, I said, my voice still a little shaky. What now? It was the question that had been screaming in my mind since the moment I woke up. What was this? A one-night thing? A story to tell? Or was it something else? Julian's expression grew serious. He took a step closer, his hand sliding from my hip to the small of my back, pulling me gently toward him until my chest was almost touching his. He smelled of coffee and sleep and warm skin. Now, he said, his voice dropping to that low, serious tone that made my stomach flutter. We have breakfast. And then I go home and take a shower. And then, I was thinking I might come back over. If you'll have me, he paused, his gaze searching mine. I like you, Leo. I'm not playing games. I haven't been, not really. I was just trying to figure out how to get you to open the damn door. A laugh, watery and full of relief, escaped me. You could have just knocked. I did, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Last night. It worked. He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the desperate, hungry kiss of the night before. It was slow and sweet and full of promise. It was a morning kiss, a beginning kiss. The taste of coffee was on his lips. And as I kissed him back, I thought, this is the color. This is the sound. This is the feeling. This is what comes after the quiet. The days that followed were a strange and wonderful education in the art of letting someone in. Julian didn't move in, not officially, but his presence began to seep into the cracks of my quiet life, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even known were there. It started with small things. A second coffee mug, a sturdy, hand-thrown ceramic one he'd made himself, appeared on my counter next to my own plain gray one. A pair of his worn work boots materialized by my front door. His ridiculously soft, faded sweatshirt ended up draped over the back of my office chair, and I found myself pulling it on when the house got chilly, wrapping myself in the faint, comforting scent of him, sawdust and soap and safety. We didn't define what we were doing. There were no grand pronouncements, no what are we conversations that I had always dreaded. Our relationship unfolded in a language of actions, not words. It was in the way he started leaving his garage door open, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. I'd find myself migrating from my desk to his workshop in the middle of the afternoon, just to watch him work. I'd lean against a stack of lumber, a cup of tea in my hands, and just listen to the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane or the focused hum of his concentration. He was a patient teacher. He showed me the difference between oak and maple, not by telling me, but by having me run my hands over the grain of the wood. He taught me how to hold a chisel, his large, warm hands covering mine, guiding the blade. You have to feel it, he'd murmur, his breath warm against my ear. Don't force it. Let the tool do the work. His lessons were never just about woodworking. In return, I showed him my world. It felt like a paltry offering compared to his tangible craft. I sat him down in my office chair and walked him through the intricate layers of a design I was working on, explaining the psychology of color theory, the subtle power of typography. I expected him to be bored, to see it as the soulless digital work he'd escaped. But he wasn't. He listened with that same focused intensity he applied to everything, asking sharp, insightful questions. So you're basically building a feeling, he said, staring at the screen. You're using shapes and colors to make someone feel trust, or excitement, or calm. I guess so, I said, surprised by the simplicity and accuracy of his summary. It's not that different from what I do, he concluded, turning to look at me. I use wood and joints to build a feeling of sturdiness, of comfort, of home. He reached out and tapped my monitor gently. We're both just architects of feeling, Leo. You just use light, and I use wood. That conversation was a turning point for me. He didn't see my work as less than. He saw it as parallel. He saw the art in my algorithms, the soul in my pixels. He saw me, and in his reflection, I started to see myself differently, too. My work wasn't just shouting into a digital void. It was a quiet, careful construction of emotion. It had purpose. I had purpose. Of course, it wasn't all seamless and poetic. There were moments of awkwardness, of ingrained habits clashing. I was used to silence. He was a man who whistled while he worked. I would be deep in a project, lost in the quiet hum of my own thoughts, and he would burst into the room with a question about dinner or a funny story about his sister, and the intrusion would feel like a physical shock. I'd tense up, my old defenses rising, and I'd see a flicker of hurt in his eyes before he'd retreat. "Sorry," he'd say, his voice losing its boisterous edge. "I'll let you work." And the guilt would be immediate and sharp. I had to learn to unbuild the walls I had so carefully constructed. I had to learn that an interruption wasn't an invasion, that sharing my space didn't mean losing myself. One afternoon, after one such incident, I followed him out to the kitchen. He was standing at the sink, staring out the window, his shoulders tight. "I'm not mad," I said, my voice quiet. He didn't turn around. "You look like I'd just set off a fire alarm in a library." "My brain is the quiet place," I struggled to explain. "Sometimes it's hard when someone opens the door without knocking." He turned then, leaning back against the counter. He crossed his arms, and for a second, he looked like the guarded, intimidating man I had first met. "So what do you want me to do, Leo? Submit a written request to enter a room?" The old me would have flinched, would have retreated into apologetic silence. But the new me, the me that was learning to be brave in his presence, stood my ground. "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I want you to keep bursting in. I just need you to be patient while I remember how to not be scared of the noise." His expression softened. The tension in his shoulders eased. He pushed off the counter and closed the space between us in 2 long strides. He didn't say anything. He just pulled me into a hug, wrapping his strong arms around me and holding me tight. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. It was an apology and an acceptance, all without a single word. We were learning each other's language, the syntax of silence and the grammar of touch. The biggest test came in the form of my family. A phone call from my mother, announcing that she, my father, and my perpetually unimpressed older sister would be in the area and wanted to stop by for dinner. The announcement filled me with a familiar, cold dread. My family weren't malicious people. They were just clueless. They saw my quiet life as a failure, my solitude as a symptom of some deep, unfixable flaw. Their visits were always a painful exercise in defending my choices, in feeling small and misunderstood. My first instinct was to hide Julian, to ask him to make himself scarce for the evening, to erase any evidence of his presence, to retreat to the safety of the son they thought they knew, the quiet, solitary, gray Leo. It was a cowardly instinct, and I was ashamed of it the moment it entered my mind. I found him in his workshop, sanding the final pieces of the cradle. The late afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the fine dust that danced in the air like fairies. "My family is coming for dinner on Saturday," I said, the words feeling like a confession of a crime. He stopped sanding, setting the block down carefully. He turned to me, his face unreadable. "Okay," he said slowly. "You don't have to be there," I rushed to say. "It's going to be a thing. You can go out, or stay here. I'll make up an excuse." He just looked at me for a long moment, his whiskey-colored eyes searching my face. "Do you want me to be there?" he asked, his voice quiet and serious. The question was a mirror, forcing me to look at my own fear. Did I want to face them alone, to endure the pitying looks and the not-so-subtle questions about my social life? Or did I want him there, a solid, grounding presence at my side, a splash of brilliant, undeniable color in the face of their gray expectations? "Yes," I said, the word small but firm. "I want you to be there." A slow smile spread across his face, the confident, heart-stopping one that I had first seen on my porch. "Okay then," he said, picking up his sanding block again. "What time should I show up?" On Saturday, my house felt like a stage set for a play I didn't want to be in. I had cleaned obsessively, hiding any trace of personality under a veneer of sterile tidiness. Julian arrived 10 minutes before my family was due, holding a bottle of expensive-looking red wine. He was wearing a dark blue button-down shirt I'd never seen before, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked handsome and confident and completely out of place in my anxious world. "You look like you're facing a firing squad," he said, handing me the wine. "Close enough," I muttered, my hands trembling as I took the bottle. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and steadying. "Hey," he said, forcing me to meet his eyes. "Look at me. It's just dinner. We're just two people having dinner with your parents. It's not a test. There's nothing to prove. You haven't met my family," I said grimly. "And they haven't met me," he countered, a familiar, mischievous glint in his eye. "It'll be fun." It was not fun. It was excruciating. My parents were polite but distant, their smiles tight. My father, a man who communicated primarily through grunts and discussions of engine maintenance, tried to talk to Julian about woodworking and was immediately lost. My mother's conversation consisted of a series of thinly veiled questions about Julian's background and intentions. My sister, Sarah, was the worst. She watched us with the sharp, critical eye of a hawk, her silence more judgmental than any words could be. I felt myself shrinking with every passing minute, reverting to the quiet, awkward teenager I had been in their presence. I answered in monosyllables. I forgot to pass the salt. I could feel Julian's knee pressing against mine under the table, a silent, steadying pressure, but it wasn't enough to pull me out of my downward spiral. The tipping point came during dessert. My mother, with a sigh that could curdle milk, looked at me and said, "Well, Leo, it's just nice to see you getting out of your shell a bit. We were so worried you were just going to waste away in this house all by yourself." The pity in her voice was a physical blow. I felt the heat of shame flood my face. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but only a strangled noise came out. Then Julian, who had been quiet for the last few minutes, set his fork down with a deliberate clink. He reached across the small table and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. It was a bold, unapologetic gesture of ownership and affection. My entire family froze. "I don't think you need to worry about Leo," Julian said, his voice calm and even, but with an underlying edge of steel that I had never heard before. He looked directly at my mother, his gaze unwavering. "He's not wasting away. He's one of the most brilliant, creative, and centered people I've ever met." He squeezed my hand. "And he's not by himself." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish. My father suddenly found the pattern on his plate fascinating. My sister just stared at our joined hands on the table. Julian had done what I had been unable to do in 30 years. He had spoken the truth, simply and without apology. He had defended me. He had claimed me. The rest of the evening was a blur of strained pleasantries and a hasty departure. When the door finally closed behind them, I stood in the middle of my living room, my body thrumming with adrenaline. I felt shaken, exposed, and strangely, powerfully free. Julian came to stand in front of me. He looked worried, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I overstepped. That was your family, your fight. I shouldn't have." I cut him off by surging forward and kissing him. I poured all the gratitude, all the relief, all the fierce, protective love I felt for him into that one kiss. I kissed him until we were both breathless. When I pulled back, I rested my forehead against his. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You didn't overstep. You stood up for me. You stood up for us." He let out a long, shaky breath. "I couldn't stand there and let them talk to you like that," he said, his hands coming up to cup my face. "To talk about you like you're broken." He looked deep into my eyes, his own shining with an intensity that stole my breath. "There is nothing broken about you, Leo." In that moment, standing in my quiet living room, with the scent of my mother's perfume still faintly lingering in the air, I finally believed him. My family had come expecting to find the same gray, solitary man they had always known. And they had. But they had also found Julian. They had found color and noise and strength. They had found us. The thought didn't scare me anymore. It felt like a victory. It felt like coming home. The aftermath of the family dinner was quieter than I expected. There were no angry phone calls, no dramatic fallout. There was just a stretching silence from their end, a void that felt more like confusion than condemnation. It was as if Julian's simple, declarative act of taking my hand had presented them with a puzzle they didn't have the pieces to solve. For the first time, the silence from my family felt like my own, not theirs. It was a space I could choose to fill or not. The power dynamic had shifted. Julian and I never spoke of the dinner again. We didn't need to. It had become a part of our foundation, a load-bearing moment that had tested the structure of our fledgling relationship and found it sound. His defense of me was a quiet, constant presence between us, a reinforcement of the unspoken commitment we were building day by day. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Our two houses began to feel like one large, sprawling home connected by a well-trodden path across the lawn. Some mornings I'd wake up in his bed, the room smelling of cedar in him, the sheets tangled around us. Other mornings he'd be in my kitchen before I was even awake, the scent of coffee a gentle alarm clock. The line between my space and his space blurred until it ceased to exist altogether. It was just our space. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was in his workshop, watching him put the finishing touches on the cradle. He was rubbing it down with a soft cloth, his movements slow and reverent. The wood, a warm, honey-colored cherry, glowed in the slanted sunlight. It was beautiful, a perfect marriage of form and function. It was a vessel for love, for hope. "It's finished," he said, stepping back to admire his work. He had a smudge of wood polish on his temple, and I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and wipe it away. "It's perfect, Julian," I said, my voice soft with awe. He looked at me, a proud, happy smile on his face. "My sister's going to lose her mind." He ran his hand over the smooth, curved top rail. "I need to drive it up to her this weekend. It's about a 3-hour trip. She'll love it." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the cradle, but his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Come with me," he said, his voice casual, but I could hear the underlying thread of hope in it. My automatic response, the ingrained instinct of the hermit, was to say no. A 3-hour drive, a whole weekend, meeting his sister, the recipient of this beautiful gift. It was a lot. It was a step into his world, a world beyond our two-house bubble. I looked at his face, at the hopeful light in his whiskey-colored eyes. I looked at the cradle, a testament to his love and his talent. And I thought of him taking my hand at the dinner table, of him telling my mother that I wasn't broken. He had stepped into my world without hesitation. How could I do any less for him? "I'd love to," I said. The smile he gave me was dazzling. It was pure, unadulterated joy, and it was directed entirely at me. My heart did a familiar, pleasant flip-flop in my chest. The drive up to his sister's place was easy and comfortable. We listened to his eclectic music collection, a mix of 70s rock, moody indie folk, and surprisingly, classic country. We talked about everything and nothing. I learned about his childhood, about the treehouse his father helped him build, about the time he broke his arm trying to jump off a roof with a sheet for a parachute. I told him about my own quiet childhood, about the worlds I created in sketchbooks, about my first dial-up modem and the thrill of discovering a universe online. We were filling in the sketches of each other, adding color and shading and detail, until a complete portrait began to emerge. His sister, Amy, was a warm, bubbly, and heavily pregnant version of him. She had the same whiskey-colored eyes and the same infectious smile. She threw her arms around me the moment we met, as if I were a long-lost friend. "So you're the famous Leo," she exclaimed, her hug surprisingly strong. "I've heard so much about you. My brother hasn't shut up about his brilliant, creative neighbor for months." I felt a blush creep up my neck, and I shot a look at Julian, who was trying and failing to look nonchalant as he unloaded the cradle from his truck. He just shrugged, a small, sheepish smile on his face. The weekend was a blur of domestic bliss. We helped Amy and her husband, a kind, gentle man named Mark, set up the nursery. We ate pizza on the floor and debated baby names. I watched Julian with his sister, the easy affection between them, the gentle teasing, the deep, abiding love. I saw the man he was outside of our bubble, a brother, an uncle-to-be, a cherished member of a family. And they welcomed me in without a single question, without a moment of hesitation. I was not Leo, Julian's friend, or Leo, the neighbor. I was just Leo, and I was with Julian, and that was all that mattered. On Sunday evening, as we drove home, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, a comfortable silence settled between us. I felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that went bone deep. "Your sister's great," I said, breaking the silence. "Yeah, she is," he agreed. "She likes you. A lot. The feeling is mutual." He reached over and took my hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. We drove like that for miles, our hands linked over the center console. I was thinking, he said, his eyes on the road but his attention on me. About what you said. About my work. About building things that last. I waited, my heart beating a little faster. I think that's what this is, he said, his voice low and serious. What we're doing. You and me. I think we're building something. Something I want to last. I turned to look at his profile in the fading light. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the soft curve of his lips. The man who had kicked down the door to my quiet, gray world and filled it with unimaginable color and light. Me too. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I squeezed his hand. Me too. The story doesn't end there, of course. It's still being written. But that moment, in the car, with the sunset painting the sky and his hand in mine, felt like the end of the beginning. It was the moment we both acknowledged that we weren't just two neighbors who had stumbled into something. We were architects, both of us. And together, we were building a life. We were building a home. The final proof of this came a few weeks later. I came home from a rare trip to the grocery store to find him standing on my front porch, a familiar, thoughtful expression on his face. He had something small in his hand. What's up? I asked, balancing the grocery bags as I fumbled for my keys. I have something for you, he said. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a single, newly cut key. It was a key to his house. I stared at it, the little piece of metal seeming to thrum with a life of its own. It was more than a key. It was a promise. It was an invitation. It was a statement. I figured since my stuff is already taking over your house, you should have the right to invade mine whenever you want, he said, a small, almost shy smile on his face. Fair's fair. I dropped the grocery bags. The sound of a carton of eggs cracking was distant and unimportant. I stepped forward and took the key from his palm. It was still warm from his hand. I closed my own hand around it, the sharp edges digging into my skin. It felt real. It felt solid. I looked from the key in my hand to the man in front of me. The man who had seen the loneliness behind my silence. The man who had made coffee in my kitchen. The man who had defended me, who had held my hand, who had shown me what it felt like to not be alone. I didn't need to say anything. He could see it all in my eyes. I unlocked my front door, pushed it open, and then I turned to him. Welcome home, I said. He smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that had started it all. He stepped across the threshold, into my house, into our house. He closed the door on the quiet, gray world that was, and together, we stepped into the vibrant, colorful world that could be. Our world. And for the first time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was peaceful. It was ours.